There are definitely things when clients come to us when they have an inheritance or anticipating an inheritance that need to be sorted out. And so while we also want to be a good steward of those emotions and the things that they are going through in that process, we're also here to help them understand what are the technical things or the paperwork or the things that have to happen. And often, and one of the sheets say this, but a lot can't be done until there's a death certificate or there are some actual pieces that have happened. But what we can start talking about when someone has an inheritance is, what is it that you are inheriting? If you've been following our blog, some of this might be a repeat for you, but what type of an asset are you even inheriting? Is it cash? Is it a investment account? Is it a retirement account? All of these things have different requirements associated. What time of the year someone passes also can impact how quickly you need to move. Has a required minimum distribution been met this year or not by the person that passed, if that was something that they had? How was it owned, whatever that asset is? Was it owned in the person who passed name only? Was it jointly owned with your parents and your mom passed 10 years ago and your dad never did anything about it? That's going to change what you need to do as well. So there are a lot of different things that we'll look at to say, what kind of an asset was it? How is it registered? Was it separate property for that person or was it joint, that kind of a registration? And then also things like beneficiary options. So some of this is work you can do ahead with, if you're either the person inheritance or you're the person receiving inheritance. And one good example that I have currently going on with a client right now is her dad has been ill for quite some time. And she does not get it. And actually it would become a tax issue because it's retirement money. And so what she did with her dad is she made sure to say, I know I'm listed as a beneficiary on your IRA, but I'd like you to add a per stirpes designation to that, which means I can disclaim my portion and it will go to my son. She only has one son, so it's nice and simple. So her dad recently passed. And they're going to go through that process to make sure that the asset skips over her. It goes to her son who can handle that much more tax efficiently and she doesn't need it. So there are a lot of things that you can do ahead of time if you have the right relationship with the person, that might pass that you'll inherit from, or for your own kids. I know this is a topic Amanda and I have talked about because she works with the kids, I work with the parents. So we kind of help coordinate beneficiary designations because how something is registered and who the beneficiaries are listed as makes an enormous impact on what actually happens when someone passes. And it can also impact the timing of how quickly things need to move, depending on the registration and those sorts of things. It's really important to understand what all your choices are. So that's something that a financial planner can help you with. That's something that an estate planning attorney can help you with. So if you have a situation where you say have a cabin or an extra property or something that you have 4 kids and you say, I'm just going to leave it to my 4 kids evenly, they'll figure it out. Maybe that's okay. Maybe there's a better way to do that. And so having a conversation with an attorney or with your financial planner to find out what are the options. What if I leave the property to the one kid who uses it and figure out a way to give equivalent assets to the other 3? Or would my kids prefer that it's sold upon our passing? Or what are all of the options that we have with the different type of assets that we have so that we're setting this up well for them? And if you're in the position of potentially inheriting, how do you approach that conversation with your parents or with the person that you might inherit from? Say like, hey, me and my sister were talking And, we're curious, do you guys have a plan in place for what's going to happen with your assets? We can start that conversation in a number of ways, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on today. But what are the ways that you can be proactive so that you're setting yourself up for all of these technical pieces to work as smoothly as possible and try to avoid some of the family conflict that can come up after someone passes?
A lot of rules related to inheriting, and I'm wondering, it's hard for just the common person to kind of know all of this. What are some of the common mistakes you have seen happen in the first few months?
So common mistakes are that people think they need to do a lot really quickly and maybe make a decision before the entire picture has been considered. And an example of something like that is, mom's sick and I need to help pay bills. And so this is maybe before mom has passed. And so she's going to add me to her bank account, or she's going to add me on something when there's maybe multiple kids. And now when mom passes, that person is the sole beneficiary of that asset because they were just trying to do something quickly while someone's, sick or needing help. And they haven't thought through, how does that impact the actual estate? Or things that happen quickly is also just to fill out the paperwork if you're the beneficiary and claim all the assets and not think about what type of an account is this going into? What are the tax impacts? How long do I have to take the money out of this account? So just, I would say generally acting quickly is usually not the best choice. Taking your time, talking with someone that has experienced this a lot, because the thing about inheritance is often it happens to you once, especially if it's from parents, because generally mom and dad, when the first passes, the other parent, the sole beneficiary. And so when the second parent passes, that might be the first time and only time you'll have to go through this type of a process. So you're new at it. Let's think about how we can talk to somebody who's had more experience with making decisions like this.
So we've had a chance to talk about some of the emotions that are connected with inheriting and some of those initial steps on the practical side. I also wanted to address that there can be a deeper and longer impact to inheriting. And sometimes it can even change how someone views themselves or their relationships or even their future. So Megan, you've worked with many individuals navigating these challenges. And I've talked with Megan beforehand, and she has some stories that she thought might be helpful to share. So there's a couple that I wanted to ask you about. You talked about one of your clients, we'll call her Emma, carrying significant anxiety around managing inherited wealth because of the messages she had received from her father. Can you tell us about that story?
Yeah. So my client Emma, in the last months before her father passed, she was really involved in his care at the end of his life, and she was over there one day and inadvertently heard her father on the phone with his accountant and said to his accountant, "I really wish I were leaving my wealth to more financially savvy heirs." And she said that she was just like, my stomach dropped, and I just felt it hit in my heart, because this was something that this was a point of tension that she had with her father. Her father was very, very concerned about protecting his wealth, and it had become a really big part of his identity. And he'd always judged how Emma had taken care of her money, and it was just really challenging. And it was like the older he got, the more tension there was in the relationship around that. And when I started working with her, she told me that she in the months after he passed, she was having to untangle the complexity of his estate with his team of financial advisors and accountants and lawyers, and they would all meet together. And she said, I was just paralyzed with intimidation. I didn't understand the questions that they were asking me. I didn't know what questions I should be asking them. And I was terrified of making a bad decision, with my father's money. And she was still very identified with it being her father's money. And when we started working together, she was able to begin, sharing with me everything about her relationship with money. And I got to share with her through my eyes that she was actually incredibly responsible with money. She just had always had this internal story that she was really irresponsible and she should be better, she should know more. And I was able to reflect to her that she was actually incredibly thoughtful and meticulous about how she was thinking about her next steps now that she had inherited this wealth. And I remember in one of our last sessions, she had just met with this financial team, and she said, I went in and I felt really confident, and I articulated exactly what it is that I need, and I felt really respected by all of these professionals. And she said it was the first time that I didn't feel like my father was in the room with me and judging my decisions. And it's just incredible to witness someone going through that transformation and really rewriting a story that they have held that maybe wasn't totally true to begin with, and be able to really see their capability outside of how they've seen themselves. And inheritance is an opportunity for that, for that transformation to happen.
How do you help distinguish between, or how does someone distinguish between honoring the legacy of someone they received money from and versus being controlled by them?
Yeah, well, I feel like in Emma's case, we talked a lot about, the modeling that she had from her father, and she was so, it was hard for her at first to get over the judgment that she felt, but she really did appreciate and honor the legacy that he had built on her behalf. And so she chose to focus on the modeling that he really had given her about financial discipline, and she wanted to honor that and carry that forward, and also take ownership of the money for herself and trust herself with that inheritance.
Like a really important role. You also worked with Alex, who had spent most of his inheritance before he sought any help with that. What did you discover as you worked with him? What was under the surface?
Yeah. So I worked with Alex. He only had $50,000 left of his inheritance. And he was in his mid-30s, and really sadly, both of his parents had passed when he was in his early 20s, and unexpectedly. And he was suddenly alone without any parental guidance at a really formative time in his life. And he actually had a financial advisor who had expressed concern a lot throughout as the advisor saw his assets dwindling. And Alex had been living in New York City, and he made a decent living and was able to meet his expenses, but not a lot of the extra expenses that he wanted in his life, like travel and other things. And so those annual expenses just started depleting his assets more and more and more over time. And when he started seeing it get really low, he started to panic a little bit, and he just wanted so badly to preserve the last of that inheritance. But he also noticed that like the more he wanted to preserve it, the more there was an impulse to spend and not pay attention. And that's when I met him, and that's when we began working together. And I'll never forget one of the most poignant sessions that we had, where he started to understand that his spending patterns and the way he was with money was in part a way to protect himself or distract himself from feeling the grief that he had experienced and never fully processed. And he also started to recognize that the money had actually become a stand-in for his parents, and it provided comfort and security really for whenever he wanted it, whenever he needed it. And that's when he was able to begin really starting to process all of the unprocessed grief. And it was really intense and really overwhelming. And so it was partly our work and partly his work with his therapist to begin unpacking the enormity of the grief. But it was not until he was able to really feel that grief and process that grief that he was able to start building his financial foundation again. And so, yeah, it's just so important, especially with tragic kind of death and an early, untimely death, or any money that comes with that attached to it, that there is as much attention on the emotional experience of the person in addition to the logistics around the money itself.
These stories feel like they really do highlight that it's not just about getting money and managing that money. There's so much more to that and tied into your own belief systems, value, and all of that. So it brings us to an important question of how is someone supposed to become a good steward of this money? And what role does this wealth play in your life? You know, how do you figure that out? Which you have done some of, but I do want to turn to you, Patricia, just to ask, how do you help someone balance honoring the past and planning for their own future, and maybe even starting to conceptualize something that they never even could have imagined, money that they didn't even know they were going to have, and things that are possible that wouldn't have been for them.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because oftentimes when a client has inherited, they come to me and they're like, okay, what do I do with this account? And I usually stop and ask a couple questions of, you know, like, did your mom or whoever you inherited from ever talk to you about what they would hope you might do with this money? Or stop and ask them some questions or explain to them, you know, how does inheritance work when you are married? You know, technically, inheritance is separate property. And oftentimes people feel like, oh, well, I'm married, so this money will just go into our joint account that we have. And so I usually will stop and have that conversation with the person to say, you know, it might make sense to open a new account where you keep this separate so that you can have this and say, like, I know that this money came from mom and I know she worked really hard for that money. And I want to do special things with that money. Or I might have a special project that I didn't think I would ever be able to do. But now that I have this money, I might be able to do that. So just stopping people a little bit to say, you know, this is money that potentially can be thought of a little bit differently than how we've looked at your financial picture in the past. Because anybody who's been working with us, like they know how long their money is likely to last and how much they can have per month. And, like that's kind of a regular thing that we're doing with clients. So this is just a curveball that's thrown in. And oftentimes people don't really have a concept of, if I inherited $100,000, does that mean I can go buy a beach house or, live for 6 months in Spain or, whatever? People don't really have an understanding of what does this money actually mean for me? So I think it's really important when a client comes to us that we try to define a purpose for those assets. Like, does this just go into the pot of, we're going to use this for our regular expenses and we're not going to change anything about our lifestyles, and if there's some left and it can go to our kids, great. Another thing that we talk about with clients is, if there was gifting that you maybe wanted to do for your kids or for your grandkids or someone in your life, a friend, but you don't necessarily want that kid or that friend or that person to understand that you have extra money, when there is an event like a death or an inheritance, that's a really, really wonderful time to gift to others, because it gives you something to attach it to. Like, I inherited some money from mom and I'd love to share that with you. And so then it gives it a purpose, and it also gives that person something to tie it to as well, to understand the gift. It may sound silly, but sometimes people don't really know how to receive a gift. And so having an inheritance and a reason behind the gift is also a great kind of opportunity that people have. So that's another thing that we'll talk about with people. And then also looking at, what are the goals that I have? Does this inheritance provide me an opportunity to reach a goal that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise? Is there a scholarship fund I'd like to start at the university I attended? Or, any number of things. Is there a goal that you've always had that you thought, I don't know that I can make that work with what I had on my own, but now this inheritance provides that opportunity? And that's something that, we'll often have that conversation with clients just in general of kind of what are the stretch goals that you'd really like to accomplish someday. And so when this inheritance comes up, we can kind of bring that back of, you mentioned that you'd like to do this someday, is that day now? Does this provide that opportunity? And also understanding someone's risk tolerance. So you maybe inherited a portfolio of super risky assets that your dad always handled on his own, and he was very comfortable with that. But now that's in your pocket, does that fit with who you are and the risk you want to take? So that's another thing that you need to look at when you inherit an asset is, does this match with me? Is being a landlord of a property that my parents managed, is that right for me? Is that what I want to have in my portfolio to manage? Or is now maybe the right time to look at changing it up and making that asset or that inheritance fit with you and your life and your risk tolerance? And I think the other thing to think about is your personal values. Is there something that asset can help align in your life to say, a value I've always had is that I want to give back in my community, and I've not known how to do that or not known what the best tax efficient way to do that is. And maybe this asset is kind of going to give you that opportunity now. So I think for me, it's a way to kind of help people understand what are all of the options that you have with an inheritance. It isn't just, go buy a new car or, some of the things that I feel like I associate it with the same things people say with someone who just won the lottery. Like, okay, you have all of this money now, you have to go like make decisions, spend money, do all of these things. And oftentimes it's not necessarily the case. I think one thing I hear said often is, you know, especially for younger couples, is you should have enough life insurance to be able to pay off the mortgage. Has anybody else ever heard that said? Like, you should have enough life insurance that the surviving spouse can pay off the mortgage. And I don't think that's ever probably going to be the right move, to just take that life insurance and pay off the mortgage. But if that's the only thing you've ever heard is, you know, well, my husband had this life insurance so that I could cover the mortgage, you know, that might be the first thing that person thinks they need to do when they get that life insurance check. So it's a role we help play for people, is to put into perspective, what does this inheritance mean for me and my picture, and help kind of search for, was there something that the person you inherited this money from, was there something they hoped you did with this money? And a little bit to Megan's point of, does that fit with you and who you are? Because it doesn't help anyone to feel guilty about the money that you've received. And another piece we often see is, we have a lot of teachers as clients, as an example. So a lot of teachers are pretty frugal people. They, you know, have their pension and their Social Security, and they've lived in the same house for 45 years, and, you know, kind of just do their thing. And then they get this inheritance, and now maybe they're able to do things in their life that their friends that they've also had for this, you know, number of years can't do. And there's a sense of guilt, or should I, if I'm single and want to travel, but none of my friends can afford to, should I be paying for them to do that? Does it cause kind of a tension in the relationships in your life? You know, an inheritance can change the position that you're in way that sometimes people don't really know how to navigate. And so looking at, does this inheritance change my picture, and do I want it to change my picture? And you're in control of how it does that. So I feel like I just rambled down a bunch of different paths there, but there's a lot that an inheritance can change about how you see yourself. And often I would say people think it changes how others view them, and that may also just be perception. You know, your friends and family may not view you any differently than they always have, may not have any of the information about your inheritance, but we can look at our situation and think, now I need to be doing all of these things or change how I live. And the reality is you get to be in control of that. And so I think for all three of us, it's trying to figure out, how do we help people get a good look at what their situation is, let them know what this inheritance can help them do, and also see what they'd like it.
There's a resource that we have on the tables that Megan will briefly touch on. But before that, I just wanted to ask each of you kind of in summary, or to wrap up, what is maybe you feel most passionate about. And we'll phrase it in this way: what advice would each of you give someone receiving an inheritance soon? And then what advice might you give someone likely to leave an inheritance soon? So answer that in whatever way comes to mind.
Well, unsurprisingly, maybe my advice for anyone is either anticipating receiving an inheritance, or is going to receive an inheritance, you know, unexpectedly soon, that you go as slowly as is appropriate. You know, there are decisions that need to be made, but to really slow down and feel as grounded as possible with the decisions that you need to make, and really understanding those decisions, and making any decisions from a really clear and grounded base. And then to take care of your emotional well-being, and whether that's journaling or seeking support from someone that can help you process all of the emotions, the whole spectrum of emotions that might come up at that time, so that isn't playing a role playing a role in the decisions that you do. And then I'll let you go ahead. Okay.
For someone potentially receiving an inheritance, I think the biggest thing is really seek out help, because you don't know what you don't know, and it doesn't need to just be from us. Like, there are lots of different places that you can seek advice. Because kind of to the example I gave before of, I've always heard the life insurance is to pay off the mortgage, and if that's all you don't know that there might be a different or a better way to do something. And so seeking out some help before any big decisions are made, I think, is really important. And also, if you know that there's a likelihood that you would inherit, I would encourage you to try to have a conversation with the person that you may inherit from. And only you know the dynamics of that relationship. I don't think there's one right way to approach a parent and say, I'm just curious, do you have a plan? Or if you have a couple siblings, or, how do you approach that conversation with your parents? But as much as possible, particularly if you have something about your situation, like the example earlier of, wanting to disclaim, it's really important that that conversation happens, because you aren't in control of what that person does with their asset. So unless you have a conversation, it's probably not going to end up like you wanted to. Another situation I had was, dad said, oh, my daughter's the responsible one. I'm going to leave everything to her and she'll split it with her brother. Not understanding that the daughter will have all of the tax impact from the assets that were received. And now he's putting a 60-year-old son in the position of having to ask his sister for money. So if they would have had that conversation with their dad ahead of time to say, I understand, and that's really lovely of you to know that I'm the responsible one, but it's not actually helping either of us to do that. And here is a way to accomplish what you want to accomplish that will be more beneficial for both of us. So, we see enough situations where there's little simple changes that could be made that make a huge impact, and avoid some of the conflict and avoid some of the, tension. Luckily, these siblings get along great and we got them all sorted out, but that's not always the case. And what if that daughter was like, forget the brother, everything was left to me, anything at all. You don't really know what's going to happen when someone dies. So I think, as much as possible, trying to kind of have that conversation ahead, which I'll kind of then jump ahead. If you are planning on leaving an inheritance, it's a really, really kind thing to do for your beneficiaries, to give them a heads up of, here's what we're planning on doing. Especially if you think you might do something that's a little less standard. Oftentimes if people have more than one kid, they leave it in equal shares to all of the kids. But if you're in a situation where one of your children is completely well off and the other may need a little extra support, and you decide that you'd like to leave more to that child, the conversation in that situation is quite important, so that there isn't then animosity between the kids of like, well, why did mom and dad leave 80% to Joe and I only got 20%? Like, what the heck? If you have a reason, they may agree or not agree, but at least the conversation was had. It can go a long way. So I think if you plan on leaving an inheritance in the future, including those beneficiaries in the conversation can be really important. It doesn't mean you need to tell them every number or amount or anything like that, but just letting them know, like, hey, we have a plan. Generally, here's what it is. And let them know if they have any questions or if their situation warrants a change in any way, being open to that conversation.
Yes, I would second all of that, and just add that it can be so powerful, whether it's a A conversation would be ideal. And if it's just a letter that is written to the beneficiaries with the intention, and even with, just maybe your hopes and dreams of what you want that money to do, just as you were sharing a little bit ago. And to communicate that is a wonderful gift because you actually unburden the beneficiary from having to guess or face those complicated feelings that might come up. And so the communication is fundamental. And there is a handout that you can all take home that I've included some general prompts for how to start a conversation and writing a letter to a loved one, and even doing some of your own inner work if you are a beneficiary on your own personal relationship with money, and helping to sort of pre-process your own the context that you grew up in and your belief system. It's just a very brief invitation to doing some of that initial work. But it is really important to have those conversations again, ideally face to face and in person. And if that's not possible, at least in a letter. But ideal to have the conversation about what those intentions are well in advance, so that you can mitigate any complexity that doesn't need to be there.
And we're going to open it up. We've about 10 more minutes. Just to any questions that you guys may have or online.
When you spoke about, like, with marriage, it's a separate, like, there's separate assets. Once they're mixed, is it mixed or it's always separate?
They are mixed.
Okay, so if you inherit property and it's paid off, but you have to pay out a sibling, you would want to do that all on your own, not with your spouse.
Correct. Because then if the spouse is contributing to the purchase of the asset, then there's like it's a little fuzzy on that. You know, there are always documents you can have in place and, say that you're going to pay that back. There's probably ways I'd say you can still maintain that as separate property. I think what gets tricky is nobody sitting, not nobody, I've had it be very transparent with this, but very few couples want to announce that they think there's some possibility that in the future they could get divorced. And so when you say, do you want to keep this as separate property? Immediately they're like, oh no, anything that's mine is my spouse's. And that's where we try to kind of slow people down. Like, it's okay. You can have your spouse as the beneficiary on this account and still keep it as separate property, because there's only one moment that you really get to make that choice to keep it as separate property. If you put it into the joint account, it is now viewed as a joint asset. And you also have to be clear about how you speak about the asset, because there can also be the argument that gets put out there of, well, yeah, they kept it in their separate name, but we always talked about that asset being what we would use in retirement. And that can go to court for arbitration, and it can be argued that forever we've had this conversation, and if there's documentation along the way that we've talked about this as this money that you inherited is our joint plan for X. So, I think it's important to say very clearly, this is separate and not involve the spouse if you want it to maintain its separate property status. And
I'm gonna say thank you.